I went on Shark Tank. I have like terrible posture. And I got this little electric thing that I wore on the back of my neck during the show.
And it zaps you?
It would zap me. And then this is so pathetic, but it worked for me.
Tube socks, boy, about to pop the lunchbox. Tube socks, boy, about to
Wall Street Journal bestselling author of Burn the Boats, we'll talk about that. CEO and co-founder of RC Ventures. Recurring guest on the hit show of Shark Tank. Executive fellow at Harvard Business School. Ellis Island Medal of Honor recipient. It's a long list. Skip a bunch of them. Matt Higgins, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I'm so glad you skipped the list.
There's like 2 pages of intro. It was exhausting. We were exhausted researching you, so I don't know how living your life has been, but I'm so excited to talk to you for a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Hey, so how about we start as early as you want to go? I want to go back when your science teacher said, see you at McDonald's. Like, is this a real story? Did this really happen?
This is a real story, although I kind of regret ever putting his name out there because I was like, but I'll tell you the story. So for those, those who don't know, I grew up in, abject poverty, hawking flowers on street corners. By the way, when somebody comes up to you on a holiday, it's Valentine's Day, which is when we're talking right now, and they knock at your window, remember, that could have been Matt Higgins. So be nice. But anyway, that was my shitty existence growing up, was basically scrounging for money. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. And I came up with a hack that was inspired by my mother, who dropped out of high school and got her GED as an adult inadvertently. And I watched her go from that to a degree of dignity at Queens College. At the time, there was a little bit of a loophole that if you were to do well enough on your GED, you could convert your GED into a grade point average and go to any college in the United States. Everyone had a back door. Nobody uses the back door, right? So I was like, well, why don't I go through the back door so that I could get a better paying job? That was the whole motivation. And so my Burn the Boats moment, the title of my book, was not the fact that I dropped out of high school. It's the fact that I failed all my classes, so I'd have no choice but to drop out of high school. And it's an important nuance. It was the first time I realized the utility of putting my back up against the wall, otherwise known as self-sabotage. And I've been following that playbook ever since. Well, anyway, bottom line is, so you can imagine this like cheerful little kid from Queens, covering up his poverty with Jordache jeans and using my flower money to do so. And then, so it's like, it seemed like a juxtaposition because nobody knew what I was dealing with. And then on the last day of high school, and I had to go through with the plan, you have to return your textbooks. I have no idea why I complied with this rule. It was probably a degree of like, I didn't really want to go through with it. So I went to return my textbook to my science teacher, and I was a little wise ass. And I was like, hey, Mr. Rosenthal, here's my book. And he's like, what's this? I was like, it's my unopened textbook. I'm dropping out of high school. Today's my last day. No bullshit, without missing a beat. He's looking dead on the class. And he's like, Higgins, what a waste. I'll see you at McDonald's. And, 16-year-old kid's like, oh, snap, you're going to take that? And I was like, I was about to pass out. Even telling the story, I get a little bit hot. And then as I'm about to walk out, again, true story. Before I walk out, I'm like, Mr. Rosenthal, if you see me at McDonald's, it's because I own it. And everyone was like, oh, Anyway, and I sat on the steps of Cardozo High School, and I packed some cigarettes, opened a Marlboro, and I was like, he's probably right. Like, statistically speaking, the probably chances are pretty high. But that was my last, day of high school. And next thing you know, I went forward, started Queens College, and the rest is history, as they say.
That is an incredible story. I'm a late bloomer. I dropped out in college. It took me a couple more years to have that inner voice who said, let's go ahead and, burn the boats. So it seems like there was 2 voices there, Matt. There was a voice that said, we need to do our own thing. And there's a voice that said, he's probably right. That voice that said he's probably right, how do you get control of that? How do you tell that voice, we'll revisit you later?
I love that you're zeroing in on that, because that voice still haunts me to this day. I mean, the reason why I wrote this book is because I'm not self-possessed. I'm not unburdened of anxiety. I'm not it's not easy for me to burn the boats. In fact, I have a tattoo on my right arm, looks like a gang sleeve, and it's burn the boats in Chinese, Pofu Chenzhou. Because I need to be reminded every day. My book is my accountability partner. So the answer is, how do you do it? You believe it. You actually convince yourself intellectually and emotionally that when you give yourself no other option but to go forth, you can achieve incredible things. And so the reason why I wrote this book, I wrote it for the people for whom risk-taking doesn't come naturally, and they needed an argument. My book is I'm a lawyer too, is my attempt to make the case to you and everyone else that the only way to be truly successful is to give yourself no choice. But the reason why I'm the guy to write it is because it doesn't come natural to me.
I mean, and that's why you're the guy to write it, because it's not natural to you, and you're speaking to all of us. And I love the book, and your book has so many different chapters on not having a plan B, right? Let's go away with the plan B. That is so intuitively tough to swallow, right? To deal with. Tell me about, you did it in high school. Where else did you say, we're not having a plan B, we're going to go all in? Was it your time at the Jets, your time with RC Ventures? We'd love to hear a little bit more about when you said, no plan B, we're doing this.
I mean, it's like over and over. Well, what I learned from that experience when it worked out was that, and I tell the story in the book a little bit, I go from high school of being, written off, which was my goal so that I would have no choice to go forward. And then I come back to my prom, and now I've finished my first year of college. Now I'm 17. I'm on the debate team. I have a lot more polish. I know which fork goes where at the dinner table. You know what I mean? I'm growing up now.
Yeah.
And then I go and I see all my teachers, Miss Vega, Mr. Rosenthal, and Dr. King, burned into my brain now. And the look of, in one case, pity and sadness, the other case, derision, it's like a combination, went to begrudging respect from adults. And I was like, interesting. Now I'm respected because I have the credentials, because my winning move worked out. Yet I couldn't explain to them in advance what my plan was. And I began to realize at the end of the day, the energy we spend trying to bring people along is a waste of time. And that the magnitude of an opportunity has an inverse relationship with how much validation you're going to receive to support it, how much evidence there is, right? Like if Steve Jobs waited for everyone to agree that we needed to carry his YouTube collection in his pocket, there would never have been an iPod. And so throughout my career, I've done two things at the same time, right? One, I have taken the opposite approach to risk. I have said problems beget solutions. First, put myself in the position of having a problem and trust that the fact that I have no other option to go forward will help me figure out how to do it. So Harvard is a perfect example. Like I always wanted to teach, but I didn't want to just teach anywhere. I wanted to teach at the best business school in the world. And so I lobbied the school and worked with them for a year to create this course. And now I'm like, oh shit, I have to teach. I don't know how to teach. Literally, this is how neurotic I am. I had a blackboard put in my room so that I could kind of work on my penmanship because I have terrible penmanship.
That is so funny.
No, I'm neurotic. Like I'm embarrassed by my handwriting because I was a little, kid in a dysfunctional environment. All my letters are backwards. There's a lot of little things about me that show half finishing. I'm sure anybody out there who carries a degree of shame knows exactly what I joke about the forks, but the forks is a true story, right? So my point is that was one. Is problems beget solutions, to put myself in difficult solutions. And two is to self-sabotage, is to constantly go ahead and eliminate any choice because it's very hard to get there intellectually. So a lot of times I have to construct around me this feeling of I've burned the boats. And, there's a great story in my book by a guy named Mark Lowry. He's a billionaire. He was head of Walmart, e-com at one point. And he says the way he manufactures crisis mentality is by taking investment in from his family. And he knows even though he can afford to lose it, they can't. And that's how he creates it. So I'm constantly manufacturing crisis stress without being in a crisis so I could replicate that burn the boats mentality.
That is such an interesting and amazing story. I have a similar one. We had a company-wide bowling and I went the day before and was bowling alone so I would not be terrible the next day with my team. Just putting out work and hours. So penmanship blackboard story is fascinating.
And I do think the way you win bowling, we need to do what we need to do in order to mitigate or ameliorate our anxiety about the areas where we feel deficient, whether it's valid or not. I think we spend way too much. Look, I believe in therapy and I've obviously, had people look under the hood. But I also sometimes you need workarounds. The energy you spend to try to negate whatever it is, quote unquote, wrong with you. Sometimes I feel like it could be better spent on workarounds. So for example, I went on Shark Tank, I have terrible posture and it was undermining my confidence. So rather than me try to deal with it, I got this little electric thing that I wore on the back of my neck during the show.
And it zaps you?
It would zap me. And then this is so pathetic, but it worked for me. And my wife stood on the corner of the set the entire time. She's such a sweetheart. And I feel totally comfortable. And every time I would start doing it, you'd see her eyes would go, just very subtle.
That is so funny.
Yeah. So my advice to anybody listening out there, if you're spending all your energy, trying to engineer yourself into an automaton, maybe put that energy towards mitigation and basically figuring out how to compensate rather than try to reverse what is very hard to reverse. I have a lot of lingering trauma from childhood and I've come to the conclusion it is what it is. I'd rather work on trying to perfect the parts that aren't broken than try to mend the parts that are.
Yeah, it's like a great investor, which you are, which is you bet on outsized return. You don't bet on all the ones that are not going to have more than 100x returns, right?
Right.
So I think we spend too much time on the things that are wrong with us, but You are who you are because you double down on, taking risk again and again.
Yeah, and easier said than done because we all spend energy on the things that aren't right. But at least if we're cognizant of it, we spend more energy on the parts that do work, pressing the bet.
Yeah. In 2012, you founded RSC Ventures. And if we look at the portfolio company, there is a love for food there, Matt. There is Magnolia Bakery, David Chang's Momofuku. There's so many concepts in there. Milk Bar is in there. There's like all these concepts you have invested in. What's happening there? Was that intentional?
It was very intentional, and it was for two reasons. One calculated, and one more about art. The calculated part was my partner is Stephen Ross. He is the founder of Related in the 1970s, one of the largest developers in the United States, one of the most prestigious developers in the world. And after interacting with a lot of founders in the food space, you sort of see a recurring theme. They usually topple over when they try to scale. And they topple over for a variety of reasons about scaling. One, they may not have the wiring to scale, right? Maybe they find it too hard to delegate, or they're terrible at picking talent. Maybe they can't handle conflict. You can't scale if you can't handle conflict. But then there's a very practical reason why a lot of them topple over is real estate decisions. They make terrible real estate decisions. And if you're an egomaniac, you presume that your concept is so great, if you build it, they'll come. So you put a unit in a shitty alley and you're like, look at the great deal I got. I'm like, what's the reason you got a great deal? It's a shitty alley. And then there are those who at the end of the day get taken advantage of, or they overinvest in build out. There are all these real estate reasons. So my thought was, if I could back relatively early exquisite concepts that are looking to scale, I could both address all the human reasons why people fail to scale. And my partnership with Steve Ross could help me channel all these real estate expertise to help concept scale. So that was a sort of calculated thesis. I only wanted to stay within things that are relatively staples, so to speak, dessert, chicken, pizza, coffee. So I didn't have to worry about coconut water, not being a thing 10 years from now when somebody watches this and says, what are you talking about, right? I wanted to be really careful about fats. And then the emotional reason, or I guess the artistic reason, was I think food, especially scaling food concepts, exists at the intersection of art and finance. And I love that. For a concept to be truly exquisite, there has to be so much art that goes into it. We know it when we see it, right? Christina Tosi is exquisite. And what she produces, so is David Chang. But then at the same time, we need to reconcile that with business. You need a 20% four-wall, and you need your occupancy cost to be sub 10%. So I just love that food exists at the intersection between art and finance. And I like to think that somewhere in my left brain, right brain, that's where I exist as well. And so that's why I'm so deep into that.
From all the artists you're working with, all the chefs you're working with, who is the most financially savvy? And you were like, oh, wow, they have that side of their brain working well.
That's such a great question. So I'm going to go with what came to mind instantly. I'm going to go with Marguerite, who is the CEO of Momofuku. And I met her when she was, probably 27 years old. I don't know what she is right now, but early 30s. She's a force of nature. And to Dave's credit, when we were early on in our relationship, and he was like, man, I don't know, I need to put a CEO in place. And I was like, really? We just did the deal. What are you thinking? And I was like, who are you thinking about? And he mentioned Marguerite. And I was like, I think she's 27. He's like, she's exactly the person that needs to be. And you know what? He was 100% right. You know why? She's both a translator and a leader and a reconciler, if that was a word. She's able to reconcile so many competing interests. The chefs who want to create art, and the investors who need to get a return, and Dave, who's just brilliant, right? And wants to introduce new things every other day. So I would give her credit as the most savvy on every level. I cannot believe how young she is, because her career is only going to increase exponentially. So just to stop there, she went into CPG without that being her expertise, because remember, she was running fine dining, right? And now we exist at stores all over America with numbers that are extraordinary. So she gets the gold medal.
I love it. We're going to just send this clip to her. That is
yes.
Incredible, kind words for her. So you go from a high school dropout to now teaching at Harvard. How much of that is a chip on your shoulder, and how much of that is the insatiable curiosity you seem to have? What's the balance there?
Great question. I have zero chip on my shoulder. I can't relate to people who are propelled by it. To be honest, I am not propelled by that. I am propelled by a simple philosophy that the joy of living is in the striving and in the pursuit. Because I got to high places pretty young, became press secretary of the mayor of New York at 26. I did all these...
Youngest at the time.
Yeah, youngest at the time. I ran the New York Jets when I was, 30, and became a minority owner in the Dolphins. My partner, Steve, minority with a lower case, but nonetheless had an interest in a team, phantom interest in a team. So all these different accomplishments, and everything would always feel relatively meaningless, if I'm perfectly honest. And maybe that's an underlying depression, or what I realized is this was all an exercise in self-soothing. And I still was running away from my past and never healed, probably never will be, from the trauma of watching my mother slip away, and I couldn't save her when I was 26. It's a long way of saying what I do realize, what does bring me fundamental joy, though, is leveling up, is asking myself, what can I do today that I couldn't do yesterday that brings me closer to want to do tomorrow? It's like a tautology, it keeps me in a circle. So let me deconstruct that. Whenever we do something great, we always feel this, this rush of adrenaline, and then we feel melancholy. And when you dissect those phases, the reason why we feel melancholy is because we realized that it was the pain of pursuit that propelled us. It was the joy of striving that we were living for. And when it's gone, we feel empty. Any marathon runner knows exactly what I'm talking about. Any Olympian knows what I'm talking about. And so what I realized is, like, how do I wire my orientation towards the universe to live in a state of perpetual growth? And so by asking myself this question all the time, what is the highest and best use of my time, energy, and resources now, continues to propel me forward. I ask that question every week. So as it pertains to Harvard, when I finished Shark Tank, I remember talking to my wife. I was such an anxious mess. I tell the cringy story. It's like in the book. It's totally embarrassing about how I wanted to call in sick and pretend I had food poisoning from salmon because I was totally wanted to chicken out. I was totally freaked out that Mark Cuban was going to realize that my bank account didn't have enough zeros, or I was just a little fraud. And I remember when I was done though, and I had done well objectively, and I also loved it. I was also very sad. I said to my wife, I might have done the hardest thing I ever will do, the most uncomfortable thing to me at least. And I was sad. And then as I was walking around the campus of Harvard, checking on Bluestone Lane and Milk Bar, believe it or not, I had an epiphany. Wait, I always wanted to teach and compete at the highest level. What if I could teach at Harvard? And I was re-energized. Now, how does it all connect? I don't believe that I would be on the radar of anyone at that level if I hadn't been on Shark Tank, if I'm honest with myself. But having been on Shark Tank opens up a lot of doors and gets you an audience. And having been on Shark Tank, I think gave me that first audience at HBS. And of course, I had to do the work for the next year. And so I would say to anyone listening, if you accept the fact that the joy of living really is in the striving for most people, then in order to ensure that you stay in a state of perpetual growth, ask yourself this simple question. What is the highest and best use of my time, energy, and resources today? That question is so important because we're iterative little creatures and we are an amalgam of everything that came before and everything we've done before. It's a little bit like a zoning question, which they ask as it pertains to land. What is the highest and best use of that piece of land today? A warehouse in Chelsea is Leonardo DiCaprio's bachelor pad in 2024. 100 years ago, it was a slaughterhouse. So we are no different. And that's how I ended up at Harvard. So it's not from a chip on my shoulder. It's from hardwiring my brain to believe that I must stay in perpetual pursuit of growth.
This might be the most important podcast we've had.
I don't know where that came from, by the way. I was like, let's lay this out.
I mean, listen, I had my therapy session today at 8 o'clock this morning, so I'm feeling great today. And I'm open for this conversation. And I think what you have that a lot of people struggle to communicate with is a past that was difficult, that people can resonate with, that has equal amount of hardship that people have seen. So when you speak, it really, connects and touches so many people. I think that's the impact.
I love that you said that because Elon Musk is amazing on a number of levels. But if I'm being a little bit critical of him, I keep thinking you have this incredible platform. What are you going to do with it? And it started making me think about this word authority. What does the word authority mean? And what are you going to use with you? What are you going to do with your authority? My authority is not that I was on Shark Tank or that I was at Harvard Business School. My authority is that I have been there. I see you. You can meet me somewhere with government cheese or anxiety. And if I share that with you, that gives me the ability to connect with people. And if you can connect with people, you can change the trajectory of their life. And when I look at some people why are you wasting your authority? What are you going to do with it? And the authority that I care about is the shared experience of struggle, not the byproduct, not the credentials. And so the purpose of the book, I was like, I'm going to share shit that people just don't want to talk about because I don't care. But I do care about getting a DM from somebody in Saudi Arabia, a woman saying, I feel seen by your book and I now feel empowered and inspired. That to me is breathtaking and much more interesting than being on Shark Tank or teaching at Harvard.
Well, listen, I saw you do the same thing on TV. My girlfriend is a huge fan of the Kardashian show on Hulu, and we're watching it and we see you. I'm like, I know him. And she's like, oh, you guys work together? I'm like, I don't actually know him, but I follow him and he's great. And he's an investor in half the companies we work with. And you were doing the same thing with her. She was a little unsure. She crushed it. but she was a little unsure. And you were reminding her, hey, you're not an influencer. You're as smart and as sharp as the best CEO in America right now out there. And you're building an incredible brand. And she really was taken by that. And you were doing the exact same thing there. So I think
that was a magical moment because, what's amazing about that, if you look at the statistics, actually, when it comes to imposter syndrome, women are way more likely to acknowledge it, which says a lot about women in terms of being self-aware as CEOs. I love female entrepreneurs and CEOs, just they over-index on self-awareness. Men experience it too, but we don't admit it. And so Kim, by being honest about that on the show, is a gift to everybody watching that. And then me being able to interact with her and model what empathy and commiserating on imposter syndrome looks like, the impact of that is tremendously catalytic. So I'm so glad that when they chose to edit it, they chose to keep that in and use that one intimate moment that even Kim Kardashian has imposter syndrome. And when she was in that class, no bullshit, she crushed it. She's sitting over a company that's worth $4 billion. Anyway, I love that scene, and I love talking about imposter syndrome.
While we talk about imposter syndrome, what is your favorite investment that you made that did not work out? And I think that's an important place for us to go because there's things we love and we wish worked out, it didn't. But you still loved maybe the founder or loved the product. But favorite thing you invested in that did not work out?
Such a great question. Now I'm trying to figure out. And I guess, how do you define workout? I'll give you the first thing that comes to mind, June oven. I don't know if you ever heard of a June oven, right? Yeah, so June oven is a magical device that you put your food in and it recognizes your food right away. It was doing AI before AI was a cliche. And the founder is Matt Van Horn, who I love. The return to investors was anemic. He did fine and he ended up in a new home. I love him as a CEO and I love that product. It was like a work of art. And so I do have some degree of longing of what could have been bigger. It's owned by Weber right now. But I say that because I love second-time founders as well. So I'm waiting to see what Matt does next so I can back him, forever. But one thing I have learned from investing, though, generally, whatever it is that ultimately undermines an outcome, and he's not an example of that because it all went fine. Whatever it is in the end that is the reason for the failure, it was present at the beginning. And I think a lot of investors who are not self-aware like to argue that it wasn't obvious when they made the decision. And that's usually bullshit, to be honest with you. That's a way to protect their ego. You look at Juicero, for example. I had Doug Evans come to my class at Harvard. Anyone who doesn't know this story, Juicero used to do pressed juice in little pods. And then Bloomberg did an article basically showing how you can crush the thing with your hand and you don't need the fancy device. It was actually not a very nice article because you could do the same thing with coffee, by the way. It's called pour over. But anyway, it killed the company. But what I was fascinated about, and I talk about in the book, if you met Doug Evans, you know exactly what you're getting as when you're investing in Juicero. So whatever the reasons were that where things didn't work out, it was an over-engineered product, it was too passionate, whatever the reasons are, I guarantee they were knowable at the beginning. And the reason why that's so important as an investor, I use industrial psychologists a lot. I've had one that's been following around inside my ear for the last 20 years because I think the reasons why things mostly don't work out, it goes back to the Italians. I'm not going to say it in Italian, but they have a phrase called the fish rots from the head. The reality is most of the problems you see show up in a business downstream actually can be traced all the way back to the top and issues that have not been resolved with an owner. So to make that less abstract, we all know the founder who resents having to be public facing, doesn't like to, thinks marketing is stupid. You're just going to hire some random TikTok influencer to sell your product, wants to keep their head down making product or playing with the Excel sheet. And things don't work out when the company can't tell their story and they go ahead and they succumb, you could trace it back to the founder. So the bottom line is one of my important philosophies in deconstructing everything I do is to realize what was obvious back in the day. And I think as much as I love June and I love Matt, I think they were more excited about engineering an amazing product than they were about marketing it.
I love that. And that's excellent. I think people should hear that. Even though it did not work out, you'd bet on that founder again. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially the one seasons, know that it's part of the game and the journey.
We all evolve and you meet people at a moment in time. When I find founders who are stuck, I'm not saying this is an example, but they're usually stuck for a reason. And if you could identify the thing that's making a person stuck, you can unlock tons of value. My buddy who is a SEAL Team 6 commander, Kurt, would say, save space for grace. If you create a little bit of space for people to be able to be open about their vulnerability, you can allow room for unlock. And the way you create the space is by being comfortable sharing your vulnerability. My book is one big cringy exercise in sharing vulnerability that enables other people to sort of open up. So the reason why I would back second-time founders is just because having gone through that journey, they're often brought to their knees. And the version you get back on the other side is a new and improved version that is not afraid to face the truth.
Wow. Last question. Might be the easiest one or the toughest one. But we'll come back in full circle to your book and to your mom. What would your mom say if she was here and she read your book? I mean, I know she'd be incredibly proud. What would she say about your book?
Yeah, she probably would really appreciate that I use her example of being a single mom going to college and the struggle, and used it to motivate me to support single moms. Because my mother, right before she died, this was like the last week, it was very sad. She had somebody in the neighborhood who died, and she was shocked that nobody cared and the person was forgotten. My mother was certain that she would be forgotten and discarded. And I used to feel the same way, to be honest with you. She died alone in a chair in a dirty apartment. We lived in a roach motel. We had no money. She couldn't even get out of bed. I used to have to give her sponge baths. Like, honestly, wanted to drive my car off a cliff half the time. So it was just a horror show, but she would always feel like she's going to be forgotten. And then the fact that I dedicated my commencement speech to her, and on the day, I don't even tell the story in the book. I don't know where I'm going. You just got me going in a rambling direction. But on the day that I gave the commencement speech, as I'm walking up to the podium, I see an older gentleman in his 80s stop the processional line. He's like, "Excuse me, I just want to say hello." And as he starts walking over me, I'm like, I have a flashback to me being an 11-year-old boy sitting on the campus of Queens College. And I stopped and I said, "Dean Savage." He goes, "You remember?" I said, "My mother used to take me to your class. You had a class above the pizza shop, the Panetta Pizza." He's like, "You remember?" He's like, "I just wanted to reach out and tell you that today's my last day as a teacher, but your mom was the smartest student I ever had." And I was like, this is crazy. And if I didn't give that speech, if I didn't go on Shark Tank, nobody would give a shit if Matt Higgins gave the commencement speech at Queens College. But by virtue of putting myself out there and putting myself in an uncomfortable position, I had an opportunity to inter my mother's memory on that campus. By showing up that day, I got to answer that question, was she discarded, by her professor from 30 years earlier saying she was the smartest student she ever had. My mother was brilliant. So I guess my mother would say, I appreciate that I wasn't forgotten and that my life had meaning.
That is,
why do you got to get me
absolutely beautiful.
All emotional? I'm gonna throw
Jesus Christ.
I'm gonna throw
Jesus.
at you.
Hate this podcast. Never talking too bad.
I thought we were going to talk about food and like POS stuff.
I mean, listen, you've talked about all of that enough. This is the stuff that connects us. This is the stuff that we want. This is the reason you are who you are, and this is the reason you're going to go so many other places, and you're an anchor to kids like me. You going where you're going, and we get to be a million miles behind, but still we get to see you, is what we care about.
Last little point, sometimes I feel like, why is it all so fresh for me? And then I realize I keep all my pain raw. I never let the scab heal, because if you keep that a little bit raw, that pain you feel propels you to feel other people's pain, right? If I was telling you this story right now in the abstract and it didn't matter to me anymore because it's so long away, maybe I also don't care about writing all those scholarships to single mothers that I do all the time. Maybe, I don't feel other people's pain so acutely. So I would argue anyone who's spending a little bit too much time on the couch, trying to put the past behind you, trying to cauterize the wounds, that, within that wound probably resides your empathy. And if you let that scar tissue form, you might encase your capacity to feel for other people. And I think that actually happens a lot. So when I get emotional sitting here with you talking about it, and it takes me back to that moment on the quad, it's very calculated, because I'm pretty sure within that pain, hopefully resides my willingness to make a big impact in this world and care about the thing that matters most, which is to use my power, money, and resources to ameliorate suffering. So as I was talking to you, I'm like, damn you, Matt, why you get so emotional about mom? Get over it already. And then I'm like, no, it's a choice. It's a choice.
I should say nothing after that. That was beautiful. This conversation was amazing. And I will tell you this again, and I'll end with this, because I think as you keep on accomplishing things, maybe you forget. And I hope, I don't think you do, but you mean a lot to a lot of us, and just keep on doing what you're doing. You're an inspiration.
Oh, thank you. I need to hear that, honestly, because I keep pushing a book because I know the impact it has. And then at the same time, I'm alienated by the guy who keeps promoting his book. I'm not Gary Vaynerchuk. I wouldn't mind living under a rock with my wife. So it's like, it's hard. So you saying that, and anybody out there who hears this and picks up the book, and if it moves you, DM me, because that DM is going to be the thing that makes me do it tomorrow. So when they stop, I stop. So thank you.
Thank you.
To fly with me. Tube socks, boy, about to pop the lunchbox. Tube socks, boy.